The morning was like any other in Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom. People filled the benches, waiting for their names to be called. Some looked nervous, some impatient, and others quietly hopeful. Judge Caprio, known around the world for his fairness and compassion, sat at the bench greeting each person with the same warm smile. Among those waiting was a young man dressed simply in a white shirt and slacks. He carried himself with quiet confidence but also a touch of nervousness. His name was about to be called Jimuel Pacquiao. The clerk's voice echoed through the room and the young man stepped forward. At first, nobody in the courtroom reacted. To most, he looked like any other young adult with a minor case to resolve. But what they didn't know was that standing before Judge Caprio was the son of one of the greatest boxers in history, Manny Pacquiao. Jimuel bowed his head respectfully toward the judge, his voice steady yet humble. "Good morning, Your Honor." Judge Caprio smiled warmly. "Good morning, young man. What brings you here today?" The room fell quiet as Jimuel explained his situation. A small violation, nothing too serious. His tone was calm, respectful, and mature beyond his years. There was no arrogance, no entitlement. If anything, he seemed almost shy, as though he wanted to be judged only on his own character, not on his famous last name. Judge Caprio leaned forward, studying the young man carefully. He had met thousands of people in his courtroom, some angry, some defensive, some careless. But this young man was different. His manner caught the judge's attention right away. Still, for now, Judge Caprio treated him like any other person, asking routine questions. The crowd listened closely, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. No one in that room had yet realized the full weight of who was standing there, but that revelation was coming, and when it did, it would leave the courtroom stunned and emotional. What happened next when Judge Caprio discovered Jimuel's true identity shocked everyone and left the courtroom in tears. Judge Frank Caprio adjusted his glasses and leaned slightly forward. He had already sensed something different about this young man, but as always, he treated him no differently than anyone else. "All right, Jimuel," Judge Caprio began, his tone both firm and kind. "You've been cited for a minor traffic violation. Tell me what happened." Jimuel nodded respectfully. His hands rested calmly on the stand and he spoke without hesitation. "Yes, Your Honor, it was my mistake. I was running late that morning and I drove a little too fast. I know that's not an excuse, but I accept full responsibility for it." The words were simple, but the manner in which he spoke them carried weight. There was no denial, no attempt to shift blame. Instead, there was accountability, rare in a courtroom where most people tried to argue their way out of trouble. Judge Caprio's eyes softened. "So you're admitting your mistake?" "Yes, Your Honor," Jimuel replied. "I don't want to make excuses. I want to do better next time." A murmur went through the courtroom. People weren't used to seeing someone so young standing in front of a judge speak with such humility. Caprio leaned back in his chair, intrigued. "That's refreshing to hear. Usually when people come here they have a dozen excuses lined up. You're telling me you're guilty and you're ready to accept the consequence?" Jimuel nodded again, his voice steady. "Yes, sir. Because I believe in taking responsibility. My parents raised me that way." The judge tilted his head. "Your parents raised you well, I can tell. What do they do?" For a moment, Jimuel hesitated. He wasn't trying to hide anything, but neither did he want to rely on the fame of his family name. He looked down briefly, then back at Judge Caprio. "My father. He's a boxer. My mother has always been the one keeping us grounded." Caprio smiled faintly. "A boxer, you say? Well, that's a tough profession. Must have taken a lot of discipline." Jimuel's lips curved into a small, almost shy smile. "Yes, sir. He's taught me discipline all my life, but he also taught me that no matter how high you rise, you should always stay humble." The judge's eyes lingered on him for a moment. Something about those words struck deep. He looked down at the paperwork in front of him and then back at Jimuel. The name Pacquiao began to echo in his mind. Could it be? But Judge Caprio didn't press just yet. Instead, he asked, "What are your goals, young man? Where do you see yourself in the future?" The entire courtroom leaned in, curious. This wasn't a usual exchange. The judge was going beyond the case, wanting to understand the person standing before him. Jimuel answered with sincerity. "Your Honor, I want to carve my own path. Yes, my father is well known, but I don't want to just live in his shadow. I want to prove to myself and to others that I can succeed with my own effort. Whether it's in sports or another field, I want to earn it honestly." The judge's expression grew thoughtful. He had heard countless people come through his courtroom talking about mistakes, struggles, and hopes for the future. But there was a purity in this young man's words, a kind of honesty that touched everyone present. A woman in the audience whispered to her neighbor, "He talks like someone much older, like he's been taught real values." Another man nodded. "This kid's different. You can see it." Judge Caprio finally leaned forward again, his eyes studying Jimuel carefully. He decided to probe a little deeper. "Tell me, Jimuel," Caprio asked gently, "do you know how rare it is for someone your age to stand here and accept responsibility so openly?" Jimuel nodded humbly. "I understand, Your Honor, but I believe respect goes both ways. If I respect the law will respect me. And if I make a mistake, I should admit it. That's what my father always tells me. That strength isn't about winning fights, it's about knowing when to stand tall and when to bow your head." At those words, the courtroom fell silent. Something powerful had just been spoken, and people felt it deep in their hearts. Even Judge Caprio paused, his face reflecting both admiration and curiosity. For the first time, the judge smiled more warmly, almost knowingly. He glanced again at the file in front of him, and the last name leapt off the page, Pacquiao. He looked back up at the young man, his voice softer now. "Pacquiao, you said? That's not a name you hear every day." The crowd stirred. A few heads turned. Some were already beginning to connect the dots, but Judge Caprio wasn't done yet. He wanted to hear it from Jimuel himself. "Tell me, son," the judge said, his voice steady but full of curiosity. "Are you, by any chance, related to the world champion boxer Manny Pacquiao?" The entire courtroom froze. People leaned forward in anticipation. Some gasped quietly. All eyes were fixed on the young man, waiting for his answer. Jimuel took a breath. His face showed humility, not pride. Then, with a small nod, he replied softly, "Yes, Your Honor, he's my father." Gasps echoed across the room. Phones discreetly lifted as people began to record. Judge Caprio sat back in his chair, visibly moved. The revelation had changed everything, and yet, the young man standing before him remained the same. Calm, humble, and full of respect. Have you ever met someone who impressed you with their humility, no matter who they were? Comment yes if you believe respect always wins. The moment Jimuel admitted, "Yes, Your Honor, he's my father," the courtroom shifted. Gasps rippled through the benches. A few people even whispered his father's name aloud. Manny Pacquiao, the world champion. Phones were already out, cameras quietly rolling. Yet Jimuel stood calmly, not flinching under the weight of the attention. His humility didn't waver. He didn't puff his chest or try to use his father's name to escape responsibility. Instead, he stood the same way he had moments earlier. Respectful, grounded, sincere. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, clearly moved. He had seen celebrities, wealthy individuals, and children of powerful families come into his courtroom before, some arrogant, some entitled. But this young man was different. There was no arrogance here, no sense of privilege. The judge took a deep breath before speaking. "So your father is Manny Pacquiao," he said softly, as though letting the words settle. "I've seen him fight. I've seen the battles he's won, the pride he's given to millions of people. But I have to tell you something, Jimuel." The room went quiet. "What I see in you today is greater than any championship belt." Jimuel blinked, humbled by the words. He lowered his gaze slightly, almost embarrassed by the praise. "Thank you, Your Honor. But I don't want people to respect me just because of who my father is. I want to be judged for who I am." That struck a deep chord with everyone listening. A woman in the audience whispered, "That's powerful. Imagine being the son of Manny Pacquiao and still saying that." Judge Caprio nodded slowly. "I understand, son. It's not easy living in the shadow of greatness. People expect you to carry the same weight, the same glory. But what I see in you is something even more important: humility. And let me tell you, humility lasts longer than fame." Jimuel's lips curved into a small, grateful smile. "That's exactly what my father always tells me, sir. He says boxing gave him fame, but it's respect and kindness that gave him a purpose." The judge's eyes softened. For a moment, he wasn't just a judge behind a bench. He was a grandfatherly figure speaking to a young man about life. "Your father has inspired millions with his fists, But you, Jimuel, you're inspiring people with your heart. The audience shifted again, some wiping tears from their eyes. There was something raw, something real about this exchange. It wasn't about a speeding ticket anymore. It wasn't about the law. It was about character, about values, about the invisible lessons parents pass on to their children. Caprio leaned forward, resting his hands on the bench. "Tell me, Jimuel," he asked, "what have you learned from watching your father all these years? Beyond the fights, beyond the spotlight?" Jimuel's answer came without hesitation. "I've learned that struggle builds character. My father came from nothing, and he never forgot where he came from. He tells me that the true measure of a man is not how he wins in the ring, but how he treats people outside of it. That's what I want to carry with me." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The courtroom was utterly silent, listening to a young man speak truths that resonated far beyond the walls of that chamber. Judge Caprio took a long pause before responding. His voice trembled slightly, carrying the weight of his years of wisdom. "Jimuel, I have presided over this courtroom for decades. I've met people from all walks of life, but it's rare to see someone your age speak with this kind of depth. I can tell your father not only taught you how to fight, but how to live." The crowd stirred again, some nodding, some even clapping quietly despite the seriousness of the courtroom. For Jimuel, it wasn't about impressing anyone. It wasn't about going viral. He was simply speaking his truth. But in doing so, he was touching hearts in a way no legal argument could. The judge leaned back, shaking his head with a smile. "You know, son, you've already won today. Not in this courtroom, but in life. Because character like yours, that's rare, and it will take you farther than you can imagine." Jimuel bowed his head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor. That means more to me than anything." The courtroom sat in awe. People had expected a routine case, another minor violation dismissed or fined. Instead, they had witnessed a moment of deep humanity, a lesson in humility, respect, and the power of values passed from one generation to the next. As Judge Caprio prepared to continue, he glanced once more at the young man before him. A thought crossed his mind. This is why the world needs stories like this, because they remind us of what truly matters, and what happened next would only deepen the emotion in the room. The tension in the courtroom had softened, replaced by something else. Admiration. What began as a routine case had turned into a heartfelt exchange, and now everyone in the room seemed invested in the story unfolding before them. Judge Frank Caprio leaned forward again, his eyes studying Jimuel as though he were piecing together a puzzle. Finally he spoke, his voice steady but rich with emotion. "You know, Jimuel, I've watched your father fight in some of the greatest battles boxing has ever seen. I remember staying up late watching him step into the ring against giants, men twice his size, and yet he fought with the courage of a lion. He never quit, he never backed down, and when he won, he carried his nation's flag on his shoulders with pride." The crowd listened intently, some nodded in agreement, remembering those legendary nights when Manny Pacquiao brought the world to a standstill. Caprio continued, "But let me tell you something. Your father's greatest victories, they weren't in the ring. They were outside of it, when he gave back to his people, when he used his success to lift others out of poverty, when he remained humble even as the entire world praised him." Jimuel's eyes glistened and he bowed his head respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor, that's the man I know at home. To the world, he's a champion. To me, he's a father who reminds me to pray, to respect others, and to never forget where I come from." The judge smiled warmly, almost as though speaking to his own grandson. "And I see that same humility in you today. That tells me he has done his job well, not just as a boxer, not as a senator, but as a father." The audience stirred again, a wave of emotion sweeping through the benches. A woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. A man whispered to his son, "That's the son of Manny Pacquiao, and look how humble he is. That's the mark of true greatness." Judge Caprio tapped his desk lightly, gathering his thoughts. He had seen many children of famous figures enter courtrooms over the years, often carrying entitlement instead of humility. But here was a young man who bore one of the most powerful names in sports history, and yet he chose to stand quietly, admitting fault, asking for nothing but fairness. The judge's tone grew softer, almost reflective. "You know, Jimuel, the world often believes legacy is about wealth, titles, and trophies. But I've lived long enough to know that legacy is about character. It's about how you make others feel, and what you leave behind in their hearts. Your father built a legacy of courage and generosity, and you, young man, are building a legacy of humility and respect." Jimuel looked up, his expression sincere. "I can only hope to make him proud, sir. Not by being him, but by being myself." Those words hit the courtroom like a wave. People shifted in their seats, visibly moved by the honesty of a son who could have easily relied on his father's name, but instead wanted to forge his own path. Judge Caprio nodded approvingly. "And that, my boy, is exactly what will make him proud. Because the greatest gift a parent can give the world is not their own achievements but the values they pass on to their children." The crowd erupted into soft applause, something rare in a courtroom setting. Judge Caprio didn't stop them. He simply smiled, knowing they had all just witnessed a moment worth remembering. Then the judge leaned forward once more, looking Jimuel directly in the eyes. "Let me ask you one last thing, son. If your father were here right now, sitting in the back of this courtroom watching you, what do you think he'd say?" Jimuel took a deep breath, his voice trembling just slightly with emotion. "I think he would say he's proud of me, not because of what I've done, but because I didn't forget what he taught me. To respect people, to admit when I'm wrong, and to carry myself with dignity." At that, the entire courtroom fell silent. Even the air seemed heavy with meaning. Judge Caprio's eyes glistened as he nodded slowly, deeply moved by the answer. "My boy," the judge said softly, his voice breaking just slightly. "If he were here, I believe he would say exactly that." And I would agree with him. The exchange left everyone in the room visibly emotional. Some were wiping tears. Others simply sat in stunned silence, realizing they had just witnessed a rare moment where fame and law stepped aside, and humanity took center stage. Judge Caprio cleared his throat and tapped his desk again, preparing to move the proceedings forward. But the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed. Everyone knew they weren't just watching a case. They were witnessing a powerful reminder of humility, family, and the legacy of values that outlasts fame. And what would happen next, and when Judge Caprio gave his final decision, would bring the entire room to tears. The courtroom was still hushed, carrying the weight of everything that had just been said. Jimuel stood there calmly, though his heart beat faster now. He had admitted his mistake, revealed his identity, and shared the lessons his father had instilled in him. Yet he hadn't expected the kind of response Judge Caprio had given. Words that pierced deeper than any fine or punishment ever could. Judge Frank Caprio folded his hands on the bench. He looked at the paperwork before him, then back at Jimuel. His voice was firm but warm. "Jimuel," he began, "on paper you're here for a minor traffic violation. The law requires me to review the facts and issue a fair judgment. But I believe justice is not just about fines and penalties. It's about teaching lessons that stay with you for life." The audience leaned in closer. They knew something special was about to happen. "You've admitted your mistake openly without excuses," the judge continued. "That already tells me you've learned something valuable. Most young men your age would have argued or shifted the blame, but you stood here and accepted responsibility. That speaks volumes about your character and the kind of values your father raised you with." Jimuel bowed his head respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." Caprio lifted a hand gently. "Now I want to make something very clear. If I were to judge you only by your last name, the easy thing would be to let you walk out of here without consequence. But that wouldn't be right. Not to you, not to the law, and not to the people watching. Because true fairness means treating you the same as anyone else standing before me." The young man nodded. "I understand, sir. That's all I ask for, fairness." Those words hit the crowd deeply. It wasn't privilege Jimuel sought. It wasn't special treatment. He only wanted to be treated like every other person in that courtroom. The judge smiled softly, clearly moved. "And you shall have it. The law must be equal. But let me tell you something, Jimuel. You've already inspired this courtroom today. You've reminded us that greatness isn't about fame or fortune. It's about humility, respect, and accountability. And that's a lesson worth more than any fine I could issue." A pause lingered. The audience could feel the emotion rising. Judge Caprio's voice softened as he spoke again. "Therefore," he declared, "I'm going to dismiss this case. Not because of your last name, not because of who your father is, but because of who you are. You've shown honesty, humility, and responsibility, the very qualities this world needs more of." The courtroom erupted in quiet applause, some clapping softly, others nodding with tears in their eyes. Jimuel himself was taken aback. His lips trembled as he tried to find the right words. "Your Honor," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. Thank you, not just for your decision, but for your words. I'll never forget them. You've taught me that humility is noticed even when you think no one is watching." The judge leaned forward, his expression tender but serious. "Remember this, Jimuel. The world may know your father as a champion, but today you've shown us that you are a champion too. Not in the ring, but in life, and that victory is far more important." The audience was visibly touched. A young woman in the back whispered to her friend, "I didn't expect to cry today, but this is so powerful." Another man muttered, "This is what justice should look like. Human, fair, and inspiring." Jimuel swallowed hard, his eyes shimmering. "Your Honor, if I may say one last thing, my father always tells me that real strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but how much respect you can give. Today you've shown me that respect always wins." Judge Caprio nodded, his own eyes moist. "That's right, son. Respect always wins." For a long moment, the courtroom sat in silence. No one moved. No one wanted to break the spell of the moment. It wasn't about a ticket anymore. It wasn't even about Manny Pacquiao. It was about a young man proving that values matter more than fame, and a judge reminding the world that justice is at its best when it teaches compassion. Finally, Judge Caprio tapped his desk gently. "Case dismissed." The gavel came down with a soft thud, but to everyone present it felt like more than a legal decision. It felt like a life lesson, one they would carry with them long after they left the courtroom. And for Jimuel Pacquiao, it was a moment that would define him not as the son of a legend, but as a young man with a legacy of his own. As Judge Caprio's gavel struck softly, signaling the case dismissed, the courtroom erupted in quiet applause. Some clapped politely, others dabbed at their eyes, and a few simply sat in stunned silence. Everyone present knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. It wasn't just another day in court. It was a reminder of what humility, respect, and fairness could look like in real life. Jimuel stepped back from the stand, bowing respectfully toward the judge before turning to walk away. The cameras that had been discreetly recording during the exchange were no longer hidden. People in the audience had captured every word, every pause, every tear-filled glance. Within moments, phones buzzed with notifications as clips began circulating on social media. One caption read, "Judge Frank Caprio moved to tears by Manny Pacquiao's son, Jimuel. This will restore your faith in humanity." Another said, "Humility like this is rare. The Pacquiao legacy lives on." By the time Jimuel reached the courtroom doors, whispers filled the air. Some recognized him only now, while others admitted they had never even heard of him before this moment. But it didn't matter. What people saw wasn't the fame attached to his name. It was the character he displayed. Judge Caprio, watching him leave, leaned back in his chair with a soft smile. He turned to his clerk and said quietly, "This is why I come to work every day. Not for cases, not for fines, but for moments like this when justice becomes more than just law, when it becomes human." Outside the courthouse, Jimuel was greeted by a small crowd. Some shook his hand, others offered words of encouragement. "Your father must be proud," one man said. Another added, "You've earned respect today, not for your name, but for your heart." Jimuel smiled shyly, bowing his head the way he always had. "Thank you. I just want to live the values he taught me. Respect and humility, those are more important than anything else." Meanwhile, the videos spread like wildfire online. Within hours, clips of Judge Caprio praising Jimuel had reached millions. The comments flooded in from every corner of the world. This brought me to tears. Respect is everything. Manny Pacquiao's son is as humble as his father. What a legacy. Judge Caprio is a national treasure. He doesn't just judge cases, he changes lives. News outlets picked up the story almost instantly. Headlines appeared. "Jimuel Pacquiao inspires Judge Frank Caprio with words on humility." From the boxing ring to the courtroom, the Pacquiao legacy continues. In the Philippines, the story hit home in a powerful way. Manny Pacquiao himself, when asked about it in an interview, smiled proudly and said, "That is my son. He doesn't need to fight in the ring to prove himself. He is already a champion if he lives with humility." The story also sparked deeper conversations. Commentators pointed out that in a world often obsessed with fame and privilege, this was a rare reminder that humility could still shine brighter than celebrity. Social justice advocates praised the exchange as an example of fairness, a judge treating a young man equally, regardless of who his father was. Back in Rhode Island, Judge Caprio reflected on the moment. In an interview, he explained, "I've had many people in this courtroom, rich, poor, young, old. But that young man touched my heart. He reminded me that the real measure of a person is not their name or their status, but how they carry themselves. He was respectful. He admitted his mistake, and he showed us all what humility looks like. That's a lesson we need today more than ever." For Jimuel, the sudden wave of attention was overwhelming but humbling. He didn't seek the spotlight. In fact, he would have preferred his appearance in court remain private. Yet when he saw the positive response, he realized something important. People weren't praising him for being Manny Pacquiao's son. They were praising him for being himself. One evening, scrolling through the comments, Jimuel paused at a message that read, "I showed this video to my teenage son." He said, "If someone like Jimuel Pacquiao can admit his mistakes, then so can I. Thank you for being a role model." Those words meant more to him than anything. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about going viral. It was about making even one person believe that humility and honesty still mattered. And while the story continued to spread across the globe, Judge Caprio's closing words echoed in Jimuel's mind. Respect always wins. It was a truth he would carry with him for the rest of his life, and one that millions of people now carried too. But the story wasn't over. The final chapter would show just how far this simple courtroom exchange could go, as it transformed from a viral clip into a worldwide lesson in humility, justice, and respect. The video of Jimuel Pacquiao standing before Judge Frank Caprio didn't just spread, it exploded. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed millions of times. By the end of the week, it was trending across multiple platforms, translated into different languages, and discussed on television talk shows from Manila to New York. Clips of Judge Caprio's words, "Respect always wins," were replayed endlessly, often overlaid with inspiring music. The internet flooded with reaction videos of people watching the exchange and wiping away tears. Hashtags like "Respect always wins" and "Pacquiao legacy" trended globally. But what stood out most wasn't the fame of the Pacquiao name. It was the humanity of the moment. People weren't just sharing a story about a judge and a celebrity's son. They were sharing a universal truth about humility, fairness, and the power of values. One teacher in California recorded a video telling her class, "We're going to watch this today because I want you to see what it means to take responsibility for your actions. Look at how this young man admitted his mistake and how respect changed everything." In the Philippines, the reaction was even more powerful. People saw Jimuel not as a privileged heir to a famous father, but as a young man who embodied the same humility that had made Manny Pacquiao beloved. One newspaper headline read, "Like father, like son, Jimuel Pacquiao wins hearts with humility." Manny Pacquiao himself shared the video on his official page. His caption was short but meaningful. "I am proud of you, son. True champions are humble." The post quickly gathered millions of likes and shares, with fans around the world echoing his pride. Meanwhile, Judge Caprio was asked in multiple interviews how he felt about the moment going viral. His answer was always the same. "I didn't see a famous name. I saw a young man with character. And character will always be more important than fame. That's what touched me, and I think that's why it touched the world." The story also sparked a larger conversation about justice and equality. Commentators pointed out that Judge Caprio didn't dismiss the case because of who Jimuel's father was. He dismissed it because of the way Jimuel handled himself, the honesty and humility he displayed. It was a reminder that fairness must apply equally to everyone, regardless of status. Jimuel, for his part, stayed quiet in the days that followed. He didn't bask in the attention, didn't try to leverage the viral moment. Instead, he wrote a simple post on his social media, "Thank you for the kind words. I only did what my father taught me. Respect others, admit when you're wrong, and stay humble. If this inspired you, then all glory to God." That post alone drew hundreds of thousands of comments. People wrote to him, sharing their own stories of how the video had inspired them to admit their mistakes, to treat others with more respect, or to be more humble in their daily lives. One man wrote, "I was about to argue with my boss about something I knew was my fault. Then I watched your video. I admitted my mistake instead, and my boss actually respected me more. Thank you," another woman commented. "I showed this to my teenage son. He told me, if Jimuel Pacquiao can stand up and admit he was wrong, then I can too. You helped me teach my child a lesson I've been trying to explain for years." The ripple effect was undeniable. What began as a small courtroom exchange had become a global lesson. Weeks later, when Judge Caprio was asked about the case again, he summed it up perfectly. This wasn't about a traffic ticket. It was about humanity. We live in a world where people too often hide behind excuses, pride, or status. But when you see someone stand with humility, admit fault, and show respect, that's when justice shines brightest. And for Jimuel, it was never about proving himself to the world. It was about living the values his father had taught him, values that had now touched millions. He didn't need a boxing ring, a championship belt, or a political title to make an impact. His weapon was humility, and his victory was respect. The final scene in the viral video showed Judge Caprio smiling, leaning forward as he said, "Respect always wins." Those 3 words became the heart of the story, etched into the minds of millions who had watched, cried, and shared it. It was more than just a phrase. It was a call to action. If you believe no one should be judged by their name, their fame, or their appearance, but only by their character, type respect in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one.